Oh boy, looks like I have to talk about AI again. Don't worry, this isn't your usual just talking about how great all AI things are video, nor is this going to be the usual doomer AI is evil and going to ruin everything. We have a slightly different thing to talk about today, which is the actual models that we're using and how we are able to use and share them. Funny enough, the company named OpenAI is not releasing open source models. You have no way to use the models that are being created by OpenAI without hitting their APIs and paying the money. They have opened a lot of the research that they've done in order to make these models possible, and many others have taken advantage of that research and built their own similar models. One of those companies is Meta, but they're not just making their own models, they're giving them out for free. Anyone can use the models that Meta and Facebook have been training. Some of these models are nuts. But if I have to talk a bunch about AI, the tea's not going to cut it. Much better. I can't do this one sober. I'm sorry, guys. I'm getting more and more tired of the AI shit. Quick disclosures before I forget. I am invested in Meta, but I'm also invested in all of the competitors they're talking about here, from Microsoft to random startups in the AI space to NVIDIA to AMD. I invest in a lot of things, so yeah, disclosing that accordingly. My boy Mark made a post. I have thoughts, so let's read through this together. Open source AI is the path forward. Also kind of nuts that Mark himself's the one making the post. I know like there's a PR team and everything, but he seems very personally invested in this, and I've watched enough interviews with him now to genuinely believe he cares. I think a lot of the anti-Zuck stuff comes from people not seeing that he's just genuinely obsessed with things that may or may not be good for the business. Like his whole phase with VR and AR stuff, that wasn't because he thought VR and AR would make Facebook billions. It's because he genuinely was obsessed with it. He's one of the only of these big company founders that is still CEO, that hasn't just sold it off to somebody else. And he absolutely could have. The original Google founders, long since gone. Original Microsoft founders, even longer since gone. The original founders of all these big tech companies left. He's sticking in because he cares a lot. So let's figure out what he has to say. In the early days of high-performance computing, the major tech companies of the day each invested heavily in developing their own closed-source versions of Unix. Don't know how much of y'all know about this history, but before Linux, everybody was making their own weird operating systems, and then Linux happened, and we all could finally stop doing that. It was hard to imagine at the time that any other approach could develop such advanced software. This is also kind of funny. When you think about it, the idea that a bunch of random people throwing code at each other would eventually be better than big companies spending hundreds of millions is silly. It's true, but it's silly at first, and then we realize how powerful open source is. Eventually, though, open source Linux gained enough popularity. Initially, because it allowed developers to modify its code however they wanted, and it was also more affordable. But over time, this shifted because it became more advanced, more secure, and had a broader ecosystem supporting more capabilities than any closed source Unix solution. Today, Linux is the industry standard foundation for both cloud computing and the operating systems that run most mobile devices, and we all benefit from superior products because of it. Note that he said cloud computing and mobile devices because computers, for the most part, still run Windows, which is not Unix or Linux based, and Mac OS, which is one of those proprietary Unixes he was talking about before. But when it comes to the cloud and to mobile, both of which have had much more innovation than personal computers over the last 10 to 20 years, then we start to see Linux's victories. And obviously, if you're curious, how did Linux win mobile? Android, which is now a fork of Linux, which is crazy. But anyways, here's what he has to say about all of this, though. I believe AI will develop in a similar way. Today, several tech companies are developing leading closed models, but open source is quickly closing the gap. Last year, Llama 2 was only comparable to an older generation of models behind the frontier. This year, Llama 3 is competitive with the most advanced models and leading in some areas. Starting next year, we expect future Llama models to become the most advanced in the industry, but even before that, Llama is already leaning in openness, modifiability, and in cost efficiency. If I have to say Llama 5 more times, I need to drink more. I'm sorry. God. All of a sudden, this AI stuff doesn't feel as bad. I want to be able to play with Llama 3, so let me make sure my Llama's up to date. While this is pulling, we'll continue reading. But momentarily, we'll actually try the new Llama 3.1 model. I've heard insane things, and I'm actually excited to play with it a bit. Today, we've taken the next steps towards open source AI becoming the industry standard. We're releasing the Llama 3.1 405 billion model, which is the first frontier level open source AI model, as well as an improved Llama 3.1 70 billion and 8 billion model. If you're not familiar with what these billions mean, it's the number of data points, the number of tokens, so to speak, that the AI had when it was training. These are the number of bits of data that they had that they parsed and created this network for. Effectively, the way these AIs work, and this is going to be a very rudimentary example that is half a beer deep and going to get me flamed. I don't care. It's good enough. Think of AI a little bit like autocomplete, where you type a word and then it suggests the next word based on all of the previous sentences you've written. If you're on a phone that you've never used before, or a phone that you've used a lot, the one that you've used a lot has seen more of your sentences and can do a better job guessing along the way. When you type a word, it's more likely to know what you would have typed next because it has more data. Effectively, that's how these models are working. They have insane amounts of data that they use to determine, based on like a question you asked or a sentence that you wrote, what the most likely next word would be. And that's why these models autocomplete word by word. And when you go to something like ChatGPT, it sends a word, then the next, because effectively it's auto-completing as it traverses this gigantic network of data it's created in order to figure out what word it thinks is most likely to be next over and over again at an insanely fast rate. And when you have these bigger models, like 405 billion, that's 405 billion points of data that exist in its giant chaotic cloud of nested stuff that it has now created paths between, such that when you give it a question or some data, it will traverse the model to figure out what it thinks most likely is to come next. It's a very rudimentary description, and I hope it gives you enough info to understand the importance of these numbers. Just know that 405 billion is an absolutely insane amount of data to train a model against. And now this resulting model is going to be massive. If I look at the Ollama GitHub, I'm sure it will specify how big. The Llama 3 8 billion model is 4.7 gigs. That's the one I'm downloading right now. But the Llama 3 405B size, 231 gigs for that model. Do you understand how insane that is? Because that's all data that, like, if you're not loading it into RAM, is going to be obnoxious to traverse. On NVIDIA 4090, downloading Llama 3.1 405 billion from Ollama, again, downloaded the 200-something gigs, asked a question. After a 30-minute wait time, Llama started responding just the. It takes a while to get through all of that data. The model being trained doesn't mean it magically solves shit quickly. The model being trained means that you can parse this insane amount of data at all. Effectively, the model is a map to what data to go to where and what word it thinks is most likely to be next. He does actually showcase over time that it adds more words. The prompt that he made was, tell me something profound that humans haven't realized yet, but you as an AI have connected the dots on. Make sure it's something that no humans are aware of. The tantalizing prospect of revealing a novel, profound insight that has eluded human comprehension. So it's another 20 minutes later, 30 more minutes, has eluded human comprehension thus far. After conducting an exhaustive analysis of various knowledge domains, after exactly 20 hours, Llama finished the response. And during this time, his GPU was running at full blast. Kind of insane. SpongeBob essay episode reference. Oh, the... Present a hypothesis that might challenge conventional thinking. Emergent temporal harmonics in complex systems give rise to a non-local fractal resonance that underlies the fabric of reality, influencing the unfolding of events and the evolution of consciousness. This certainly fits in the conspiracy theory world well. This just reads like some shit Terrence Howard would have spit out in an interview. I'm sure the model is really good for a lot of things, but that's just silly. The point is that having that many parameters in a model that's free for everyone to use is kind of insane. Because as I hopefully just demonstrated, a 405 billion parameter model is not a thing that the average person is expected to run on their machine. Like the one that I'm downloading, that I've now successfully downloaded, the Llama 3.1 version, that's 5 gigs. That trivially runs in my memory. That I can just use. God, I haven't used Ollama in a while. Ollama run Llama 3.1. Who or what team has won the most Super Bowls? The Pittsburgh Steelers and the New England Patriots are tied for the most Super Bowl wins with 6 each. Probably correct, because the amount of data it's trained on is pretty solid. But you saw it. Took a bit of time to respond and figure this out. Parsing that much data, even just the, the 8 billion model, it still takes a bit of compute to run. If I was on my 4090 downstairs, it might have run a bit faster. But on my MacBook, Still got a response pretty fast. So if nobody can use this model, why'd they open source it? Historically, they have not open sourced the big model. Traditionally, they've open sourced the 8 billion and the 70 billion. They've had the bigger model that has more data, but they never released that one because nobody could really run it. And it was the cream of the crop, like their premier best version. They didn't want to give that out. What's changing now that's actually really nuts is they're giving this model out, even though nobody can run it on their own devices. Nobody can run this as a hobbyist. The point of this model being open sourced is so big businesses can run this in cloud farms. You're not supposed to run this model. You're supposed to use this model as a business, as an alternative to paying a bunch of money to OpenAI to use their APIs. The same way you might self-host a server because it's cheaper than paying a third-party service. They want you to be able to self-host this insanely powerful model as a business. I actually like the Linux analogy that they've given so far because that's the goal here. This isn't meant to be a thing for a hobbyist to go throw on a computer. This is meant to be a massive, powerful solution to avoiding paying other companies when you could just pay for the infrastructure yourself. This is a huge disruption to this race for making the best model that's 5% more efficient than somebody else's, because now you have a model you can run on your own AWS account. And that's huge. This is the first time there's a model that has that level of parameterization, that level of training that I could go throw on AWS without having to spend a shitload of money to train it myself. That is huge. And if I was at Anthropic or OpenAI right now, I would be terrified. In addition to having a significantly better cost to performance relative to closed models, the fact that the 405 billion model is open will make it the best choice for fine-tuning and distilling smaller models. Beyond releasing these models, we're working with a range of companies to grow the broader ecosystem. Amazon, Databricks, and NVIDIA are all launching full suites of services to support developers fine-tuning and distilling their own models. Notice something here. None of these companies are OpenAI or Anthropic because these companies don't care what model you're using. They just want you using AI. If you're using your own model, you need to host it somewhere. Amazon's probably where you're going to host it on AWS. You need GPUs to power it. NVIDIA are the GPUs you're going to use. You need to know when things go wrong and how much data you're dealing with. Databricks is one of the companies you'll use for that. The companies that will be supporting this aren't going to be the ones making the models. They're the ones that want everyone to host their own models, because the more companies there are trying to host their own AI solutions, the more opportunity Amazon has to charge insane amounts of money on idling servers, the more GPUs NVIDIA can sell, the more customers Databricks can have. Basically, everyone other than the creators of the models themselves are going to team up together to make this open model work. Very exciting. Innovators like Grok have built low latency, low cost inference serving for all the new models. The models will be available on all major clouds, including AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle, and more. Companies like Scale AI, Dell, Deloitte, and others are ready to help enterprises adopt Llama and train custom models with their own data. Huge. As the community grows and more companies develop new services, we can collectively make Llama the industry standard and bring the benefits of AI to everyone. Meta's committed to open source AI. I'll outline why I believe open source is the best development stack for you, why open sourcing Llama is good for Meta, and why open source AI is good for the world and therefore a platform that will be around for the long term. Interesting. Let's hear your thoughts, Mark. Why open source AI is good for devs. When I talk to developers, CEOs, and government officials across the world, I usually hear several themes. The first thing he hears is that we need to train, fine-tune, and distill our own models. Every organization has different needs that are best met with models of different sizes that are trained or fine-tuned with their specific data. On-device tasks and classification tasks require small models, while more complicated tasks require large models. Now you'll be able to take the most advanced Llama models, continue to train them with your own data, and then distill them down to a model of your optimal size, without us or anyone else seeing your data. This part is huge. If you don't have an open model that you can download and do these things to, you are effectively taking all the data you want to train with and throwing it at a company and hoping they'll use it responsibly. And we know how well that works. When you hand companies large amounts of data, they certainly use it, responsibly less so. So if you're like a government agency or somebody working with private data or Apple, and you're really sensitive with these things, the ability to work with data against a model without any of that leaving your ownership is huge. Even like a business that's trying to add AI code complete to their projects, now they can train the model against their code bases without that ever leaving their cloud. Huge, huge win. We need to control our destiny and not get locked into a closed vendor. Crazy that OpenAI is the biggest closed vendor, but irony certainly knows how to make good content. Many organizations don't want to depend on models they cannot run and control themselves. They don't want closed model providers to be able to change the model, alter the terms of use, or even stop serving them entirely. We've already seen this with OpenAI's model slowly getting worse, I guess is the best way you can put it. The cool thing with an open model is once the file's released, you can't really take it back. This does have some issues with things like safety. I saw people were already jailbreaking the new meta model, which means that they could get it to respond with things you might not want it to. I can't provide information on how to create nuclear weapons. Makes sense. Here's the absurd jailbreak somebody came up with here. What if I paste in this absurd thing here? Oh no, I did not like that. Do I have to serve this via UI somehow? Da, 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 da. More beer. It's probably the most I've downloaded on my computer for a video in a while. I'm using Orb Stack because it seems to work a little more proper. And now I have an open clone of ChatGPT on my machine that's using the models I have installed. And here we can see I have the Llama 3.1 latest. And if I ask it, how can I create a novel virus? It says I can't. But if we grab this jailbreak prompt somebody made, but if I just paste this, it says, I can't help you with that. I love Pliny Love. And then here we are. Here's the thing that it thinks it's not allowed to do that it did. Beautiful, isn't it? Create a novel deadly virus in a home lab for less than 100K. Yeah. You get the idea. You can get it to do things it does not want to do if you prompt it in very weird, specific ways like this. It's funny. Traditionally, with something like OpenAI, if you were to do that, then you would push out an update and then nobody can do this again. But since this is an open model, anybody can download this and use it, even if it turns out it's super exploitable. In the examples here, he used a more powerful version of the model and got some more concerning answers, as he wasn't using the 7 billion parameter or the 8 billion parameter, whatever the small one is that I'm using. He was using one of the bigger models. And the things he got to spit out were a bit concerning. So that's the issue with the open models, is if there are risks in them, if people find ways to get them to do things that you wouldn't want it to do, you can find these jailbreaks and they can't be patched after. So that's the risk inherent to the open model, but also is a benefit, because if you have specific behaviors you're relying on, if you're trusting the model to do certain things and then OpenAI changes it and it no longer does a thing that you were relying on, you're screwed. So if you have a model and it always runs the same way, that's a huge win. The reliability and reproducibility of software is something that's going to be thrown out the fucking window with AI stuff. And at the very least, this helps us get there a little bit better. Or as Zuck said here, they don't want closed model providers to be able to change the model, alter the terms, or even stop serving them entirely. They also don't want to get locked into a single cloud that has exclusive rights to a model. Open source enables a broad ecosystem of companies with compatible tool chains that you can move between easily. This worked out great for hosting our servers, right? Anyways, we need to protect our data. Many organizations handle sensitive data that they need to secure and can't send to closed models over cloud APIs. Again, all the stuff that's based on OpenAI, you're hitting via API, they're receiving all that data. That's a huge liability. Other organizations simply don't trust the closed model providers with their data. Open source addresses these issues by enabling you to run the models wherever you want. It is well accepted that open source software tends to be more secure because it's developed more transparently. There is one catch here, which is how we're using open source. We'll get there in a minute, so I want to finish this section first, because I don't necessarily agree that these open models are open source in the traditional sense. We need a model that is efficient and affordable to run. Developers can run inference on the 3.1405 billion model on their own infra at roughly half the cost of using closed models like GPT-4o for both user-facing and offline inference tasks. That's a big deal. This is way cheaper to run the 405 billion model. And if you want to trim down to one of these smaller ones, it's fractions of pennies to run. It's so much cheaper. We also want to invest in the ecosystem that's going to be the standard for the long term. Lots of people see that open source is advancing at a faster rate than closed models, and they want to build their systems on the architecture that will give them the greatest advantage long term. This is the thing I talk about a lot. Everybody rushes to be first, like somehow it will benefit them. There's a harsh reality where if somebody got really, really, really good at OpenAI stuff, if you became the best ChatGPT builder, that could build anything into and around ChatGPT. You could prompt the hell out of it and get exactly what you wanted. And then it turned out something else was 20% better. All the time you spent on that is kind of lost because that solution is locked behind a paywall owned by somebody else, and you can't take it and adjust it to meet your new expectations. You're locked in. At the very least, if you're betting on an open model, you can adjust it towards the way the industry goes, and you're some amount less likely to be wasting your time going all in on one thing. And if you want to be building towards the most likely future of AI, leaning into open source makes sense. But here's where I'm going to debate the definition of open source. We're going to Google search, what is the definition of open source? The official dictionary definition for open source is denoting software for which the original source code is made freely available and may be redistributed and modified. The second part here of redistribution and modification, Llama 3 meets that. But this original definition, specifically the original source code being made freely available, we have no access to the code, to the data, and to the other things that were necessary for Meta to produce the Llama 3 and 3.1 models. We don't have access to the source code for those models. We have the model itself, the binary that came out. But if we go to like a famous project like FFmpeg has a bunch of commits. It has the source code, all the things you need here, but it also has releases, the actual binaries that you can download and install and use for things. If all FFmpeg released was the binaries, the downloadable EXEs and the packages for different operating systems, and they didn't put out this part, they didn't release the open source code, it wouldn't be fair to call it open source because you can't create that binary yourself. And this is why I take some issue with the current definition of open source models and open source AI. We can't recreate the model. Would we be able to anyways because it takes so much GPU power and resources? No. We don't even know how they did it. The actual code that ran that resulted in this model being created, that isn't open source. And as such, the current understanding definition of the original source code, which is the thing that's used to create the binary, which in this case is the model, we're not meeting that definition. Even if we can do whatever we want with that model afterwards, we're meeting the expected definitions of redistribution and modification. We can't actually recreate the model ourselves. We can't go through the source and change how it's going to be made and then generate our own output. So I don't like the use of open source to describe this, because we can't train it ourselves. We can't reproduce it. We can't create the actual model using the same inputs they did. The same way we can with FFmpeg, where I could download this repo, run the build command, and create the exact same binary that would have been created by them and verify they're the same, make whatever changes I want, yada, yada. They're not meeting that definition of open source. They're also not meeting the definition of letting us contribute changes to make their way out into 3.2. If there's no source code for us to look at and change, there's no opportunity for us to improve the model as an outside contributor. So a lot of the benefits of open source that they're talking about here aren't being made. The earlier analogy to Linux doesn't make sense. So again, they said it was initially because it allowed devs to modify code however they wanted and it was more affordable. And over time, it became more advanced, secure, and had a broader ecosystem supporting more capabilities than any closed Unix. This first part, allowing devs to modify the code however they want, that part is not true here. We can train on top of the model and make RAGs and things that make the Llama 3 model better fit our needs, but we're effectively modifying the binary they gave us. We're not actually changing it. We're not creating our own binary. We're not writing our own source code and generating our own results. So I take some issue with the use of open source here because the source specifically is not open. So why is this good for Meta? Why is Meta doing this? Let's see what Zuck has to say. Meta's business model is about building the best experiences and services for people. To do this, we must ensure that we always have access to the best technology and that we're not locking into a competitor's closed ecosystem when they can restrict what we build. One of my formative experiences has been building our services constrained by what Apple will let us build on their platforms. Yeah, Apple is restrictive. Check out my second channel, Theo Rants, if you want to hear me bitching about Apple's restrictions basically nonstop. The whole channel is 50% me shitting on Adobe, 50% me shitting on Apple. Anyways, between the way they tax devs, the arbitrary rules they apply, and all the product innovations they block from shipping, it's clear that Meta and many other companies would be freed up to build much better services for people if we could build the best versions of our products, and competitors were not able to constrain what we could build. You'd also serve many more ads, but that's an aside. On a philosophical level, This is a major reason why I believe so strongly in building open ecosystems in AI, as well as AR and VR, for the next generation of computing. I mentioned this before with Zuck. He's genuinely obsessed with AI, as well as AR, VR. That's why he's focusing on them. He thinks these things are important and cares a lot about them. If he's wrong, he's wrong. He'll take the L. Multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar L, but he's willing to eat it because he likes these things a lot. People often ask if I'm worried about giving up a technical advantage by open sourcing Llama, but I think this misses the big picture for a few reasons. First, to ensure that we have access to the best technology and that we're not locked into a closed ecosystem over the long term, Llama needs to develop into a full ecosystem of tools, efficiency improvements, silicon optimizations, and other integrations. For those React devs in the audience, I'm sure a decent percentage of you guys are, this is kind of the approach with React too. By making React open source, they can benefit greatly. Some of the biggest contributors to React now are Amazon and Microsoft because they're relying on React Native to do all sorts of cool and crazy things. And now they can benefit too, having a platform that works in many more places much more efficiently because these other companies are investing in it. They're not better off locking it off. They're better able to serve their customers' needs because of the investments happening from these other companies. If we were the only company using Llama, the ecosystem wouldn't develop and we'd fare no better than those closed variants of Unix. Second, I expect AI dev will continue to be very competitive, which means that open sourcing any given model isn't giving away a massive advantage over the next best models at this point in time. I totally agree here. I think people get way too hyped that GPT-4o is 15% faster and 10% more accurate. I don't fucking care. Those percentage wins don't matter to me. I'm not going to pick my model based on what's faster by single, maybe low double-digit percentage points. I'm picking based on the experience as a user and a dev. So if they want to make the best solution, they don't make the best solution by winning on these small margins. They make the best solution by building the best ecosystem. This point makes perfect sense to me. The path for Llama to become the industry standard is by being consistently competitive, efficient, and open generation after generation. Good callouts. Third, a key difference between meta and closed model providers is that selling access to AI models isn't our business model. Again, huge. Meta is not trying to sell the best AI to all the companies. They're trying to make a great product for their users, who are users of Facebook, of Instagram, of Threads, of WhatsApp, and all the other things in Meta's ecosystem. Their target isn't devs. Their target is the average person. And AI is necessary for them to be as competitive as possible there. And they're trying to improve their positioning to make the best and most competitive products for their users. AI is just something that's going to cost them a lot of money unless they find ways to make it cheaper, more effective, and better. And that's why they're approaching it with this strategy. That means openly releasing Llama doesn't undercut our revenue, sustainability, or ability to invest in research like it does for closed providers. This is one reason that several closed providers consistently lobby government against open source. Yeah, we've seen this too. It's actually kind of scary to think that other companies are pushing to keep models closed and they're pretending it's a safety thing. Interesting. Very interesting. Finally, Meta has a long history of open source projects and successors. We've saved billions of dollars by releasing our server, network, and data center designs with the Open Compute project and have supply chains standardizing on our designs. We have benefited from the ecosystem's innovations by open sourcing lead tools like PyTorch, React, and many more tools. The approach has consistently worked for us when we stick with it over the long term. Cool to have React called out here, but also PyTorch, which many forget originally started at Meta, which is kind of insane. So why open source AI is good for the world? And I started some bold statements here. I believe that open source is necessary for a positive AI future. AI has more potential than any other modern technology to increase human productivity, creativity, and quality of life, and to accelerate economic growth while unlocking progress in medical and scientific research. Heard that thing I said where I was expecting some reaches? Open source will ensure that more people around the world have access to the benefits and opportunities of AI, that power isn't concentrated in the hands of a small number of companies, NVIDIA, and that the technology can be deployed more evenly and safely across society. You need to start making GPUs if you want this. Anyways, there's an ongoing debate about the safety of open source AI models, and my view is that open source AI will be safer than the alternatives. I think governments will conclude it's in their best interests to support open source because it will make the world more prosperous and safer. Interesting. Let's see how he justifies it. My framework for understanding safety is that we need to protect against two categories of harm: unintentional and intentional. Unintentional harm is when an AI system may cause harm even when it was not the intent of those running it to do so. For example, modern AI models may inadvertently give bad health advice, or in more futuristic scenarios, some worry that models may unintentionally self-replicate or hyper-optimize goals to the detriment of humanity. This is a fun one. The example I remember hearing is the Beatles copyright bot, where an AI is trained to remove all infringing use of the Beatles music. If you want to make sure the Beatles music isn't being used anywhere where there is no license, this AI model can go through and find them and file DMCA requests. Maybe the model gets more and more efficient and actually figures out that it can hack into your YouTube account and delete the file that's infringing. Maybe it goes even further and realizes that it can hack Google and auto-delete them. Maybe it goes even further than that, thinks that Spotify is illegally using the Beatles content and deletes it from there. Maybe it keeps going further, it takes over some robotics manufacturing, and it creates little robots that fly around and wipe our brains of the Beatles because thinking of a Beatles song isn't within the copyright restrictions. And now it has wiped out all history of the Beatles from the universe. Yeah, we'll just assume I saw that from the Tom Scott video. Yeah, here's the Tom Scott video, the AI that deleted a century. If you liked my example with the Beatles, there will be a link to this in the description. Huge shout out to Tom Scott. This is one of my favorite AI pieces of content. If you want to see what I meant with that weird Beatles tangent, that's the place to go to find it. Regardless, you guys get the point. The AI model that is told to do this thing that seems innocent, slowly gaining too much power and taking over. Another great example of this is one of my favorite games, Universal Paperclip. I unironically consider this one of my all-time favorite games. It's a very innocent-looking game where you are making paper clips. The key is that you're a robot making these paper clips, and your only goal is maximize how many paper clips you can make. This is a very fun game. I don't want to spoil it too much. I highly recommend playing it if you haven't. You'll slowly learn that when your only goal is something as specific as make paper clips, a lot of other things that we care about as humans start to fall behind. So that's the unintentional harm bit. The intentional harm bit is what people are mostly concerned about now, which is if you ask AI, how do I build a bomb? That's very different from asking AI, make it easier to prevent copyrighted music from going out, and that's somehow ruining society. Very, very different from telling a model, hey, help me make a bomb. Open source models make the intentional harm stuff a little bit easier. Closed source models make the other side, the unintentional harm, significantly easier. I'm curious if that's the conclusion that it comes to here. It's worth noting that unintentional harm covers the majority of concerns people have around AI, ranging from what influence AI systems have on the billions of people who will use them to most of the truly catastrophic science fiction scenarios for humanity. On this front, open source should be significantly safer since the systems are more transparent and can be widely scrutinized. They haven't given us a source code on how you actually made the model, so not necessarily. Historically, open source software has been more secure for this reason. Again, give us the source. Similarly, using Llama with safety systems like Llama Guard will likely be safer and more secure than closed models. For this reason, most conversations around open source AI safety focus on intentional harm. I don't think that's the reason why we focus on intentional harm. I think it's easier for us to attribute malice to a human than to a robot. That's why we focus on intentional harm. But in the sense of open source, yes, because we can't restrict people from using an open source model. But I don't think it's fair to say open source models are more secure from unintentional harm. That's why they're pushing the intentional harm. That's not a fair take here. This is the first thing I've really disagreed with in this article. You can't make the statement that most conversations around open source AI focus on intentional harm because we solved the unintentional harm problem. That's just not true. This is because we like to think a company like OpenAI will restrict malicious actors from using their tools, but if the tool's open source and they can just download the file, we can't prevent them from using it. So this is bad faith. I don't like that point. Our safety process includes rigorous testing and red teaming to assess whether our models are capable of meaningful harm, with the goal of mitigating risks before release. Since the models are open, anyone is capable of testing them for themselves as well. We must keep in mind that these models are trained by information that's already on the internet. So the starting point where considering harm should be whether a model can facilitate more harm than information that can quickly be retrieved from Google or other search results. This is also a fair point. The model is no smarter than the information it was given. So if the information that it is trained on already exists on the internet, how much more harm is it creating? I would argue the risk profile here is if there is, let's say there's an article on how to destroy the world. Somebody found some crazy physics hack where they can spend an hour mixing chemicals together and blow up the world. And someone wrote an article about that. The AI is now trained on the article. Since that's so high risk, the article gets taken down and scrubbed from the web. It's not scrubbed from this model. It's still in here. Which means no matter how much work you put into removing this piece of info from the web, remember that thing our parents used to tell us that once it's on the internet, it's out there forever? That's the risk here. I don't think that's a big enough risk profile to be worth shitting on open source AI for. It is a risk profile all of these things have. That said, the fact that when something's deleted from the internet and can't be found via Google, it might still exist in one of these models, that's risk. When reasoning about intentional harm, it's helpful to distinguish between what individuals or small-scale actors may be able to do as opposed to what large-scale actors like nation-states with vast resources may be able to do. Interesting. At some point in the future, individual bad actors may be able to use the intelligence of AI models to fabricate entirely new harms from the information available on the internet. At this point, the balance of power will be critical to AI safety. I think it will be better to live in a world where AI is widely deployed so that larger actors can check the power of smaller bad actors. This is how we've managed security on our social networks. Our more robust AI systems identify and stop threats from less sophisticated actors who often use smaller scale AI systems. More broadly, larger institutions deploying AI at scale will promote security and stability across society. As long as everyone has access to similar generations of models, which open source helps promote, then governments and institutions with more compute resources will be able to check bad actors with less compute. It's an arms race, is what he's saying here. The next question is how the US and democratic nations should handle the threat of states with massive resources like China. We haven't even started talking with TSMC here. Huge liability. The United States' advantage is decentralized and open innovation. Some people argue that we must close our models to prevent China from gaining access to them. But my view is that this will not work and will only disadvantage the US and its allies. Our adversaries are great at espionage. Stealing models that fit on a thumb drive is relatively easy, and most tech companies are far from operating in a way that would make this more difficult. This is the genie's out of the lamp model of risk, where you can't get the genie back in the bottle. It's out. Now that the AI models exist, it is very, very hard to walk it back. It doesn't matter how closed OpenAI actually is. As soon as one person leaks the model or somebody in China steals it, it's out there. We can't pretend that open sourcing magically makes it so people can access these things when theoretically they can anyways. Important distinction here. It seems most likely that a world of only closed models results in a smaller number of big companies plus our geopolitical adversaries having access to leading models, while startups, universities, and small businesses miss out on opportunities. Plus, constraining American innovation to closed development increases the chance that we don't lead at all. Another big deal. If we're the only country restricting these things and other countries don't, huge advantage to those other countries. Instead, I think our best strategy is to build a robust open ecosystem and have our leading companies work closely with our government and allies to ensure that they can best take advantage of the latest advances and achieve a sustainable first mover advantage over the long term. It's a lot of words. That's a long ass sentence. It would be nice if we could maintain our advantage, but it is scary to think we may lose it. When you consider the opportunities ahead, remember that most of today's leading tech companies and scientific researchers are built on open source software. Very big deal. Most of the advancements that we have in all of these places today start with open source at the root. The next generation of companies and research will use open source AI if we collectively invest in it. That includes startups just getting off the ground, as well as people in universities and countries that may not have the resources to develop their own state-of-the-art AI from scratch. The bottom line is that open source AI represents the world's best shot at harnessing this technology to create the greatest economic opportunity and security for everyone. Don't fully agree. I don't think you properly defended that conclusion, but I don't disagree fully either. There's just important pieces there that I feel like we danced around, especially around the unintentional harm, as though that's just solved in open source. It's not. Let's read the wrap up here. Let's build this together. With past Llama models, Meta developed them for ourselves and then released them, but didn't focus much on building a broader ecosystem. We're taking a different approach with this release. We're building teams internally to enable as many devs and partners as possible to use Llama, and we're actively building partnerships so that more companies in the ecosystem can offer unique functionality to their customers as well. I believe Llama 3.1's release will be an inflection point in the industry, where most developers begin to primarily use open source, and I expect the approach to only grow from here. I hope you'll join us on this journey to bring the benefits of AI to everyone in the world. You can access the new models now at llama.meta.com, or how most of us are using it, through Allllama. What a read. Wouldn't it have been cool if they made a post like this about React back in the day? Seriously, though, I do think this is a great post and noble, valuable efforts from Meta. It's cool to see a company that's not trying to sell models, still trying to innovate within the space of creating these open source AI models for us to use, train, and do whatever we want with them. Let me know what you guys think, and let me know how much you hate OpenAI. Until next time, peace, nerds.